Marcus Williams had always been the type of person who thought rules didn't apply to him. At 28 years old, he worked as a marketing executive in London and lived his life with an arrogant swagger that rubbed most people the wrong way. His friends often warned him about his attitude, but Marcus brushed off their concerns with a laugh and a wave of his hand. On that crisp Tuesday morning in October, Marcus was running late for an important client meeting near Buckingham Palace. Traffic had been terrible, and his expensive suit was already wrinkled from the stress of the morning. As he hurried down the mall, checking his phone every few seconds, he noticed the familiar sight of the royal guards standing at their posts. These guards, with their iconic red uniforms and tall black hats, were a common sight for locals like Marcus. Most people respected them and understood they were highly trained soldiers doing an important job. But Marcus had always found them amusing, thinking they were just for show, like living statues put there to entertain tourists. As he walked past the palace gates, Marcus was frustrated to see a small crowd of tourists gathering around one particular guard. They were taking pictures and chatting excitedly, completely blocking the sidewalk he needed to use as a shortcut to his meeting. The guard stood perfectly still, staring straight ahead with the discipline and composure that these soldiers are famous for. Marcus checked his watch and realized he was now 15 minutes late. His client was notoriously impatient, and this meeting could make or break his career. The crowd of tourists seemed to be growing larger, and they showed no signs of moving anytime soon. Children were pointing and giggling, adults were posing for selfies, and everyone seemed to be having a wonderful time. But Marcus wasn't having a wonderful time. His frustration was building with each passing second. He pushed through the crowd, muttering complaints under his breath about tourists and their cameras. Some people gave him dirty looks as he squeezed past them, but Marcus didn't care. He had more important things to worry about than being polite to sightseers. When he reached the front of the crowd, Marcus found himself face to face with the royal guard. The soldier was a tall, imposing figure, who couldn't have been much older than Marcus himself. His uniform was immaculate, his posture was perfect, and his expression was completely neutral. He held his rifle at the ready and stared straight ahead, seemingly unaware of the crowd around him. For a moment, Marcus paused. There was something impressive about the guard's discipline and professionalism. But then Marcus looked at his watch again and remembered his important meeting. His frustration returned with a vengeance, and he made a decision that would change everything. Instead of walking around the crowd like a reasonable person would do, Marcus decided he had had enough. He was tired of these guards acting like they were so important when they were clearly just there for show. He was tired of tourists treating them like celebrities when they were just regular people in fancy costumes. Most importantly, he was tired of being late because other people couldn't be considerate. Marcus stepped closer to the guard, close enough that he could see the man's face clearly. The guard's eyes remained fixed straight ahead, but Marcus thought he detected a slight tension in the soldier's jaw. The crowd behind them continued to chatter and take pictures, completely unaware that something was about to happen. What Marcus didn't know was that this particular guard, Sergeant James Mitchell, was not someone to mess with. James had served 3 tours of duty in Afghanistan and had been awarded several medals for his service. He had been a royal guard for 2 years and took his duty to protect the royal family and their property very seriously. Marcus also didn't know that there were security cameras recording everything that was about to happen. He didn't know that plainclothes police officers were stationed throughout the area, watching for exactly the kind of trouble he was about to cause. Most importantly, he didn't know that interfering with a royal guard on duty was a serious criminal offense that could result in arrest and prosecution. All Marcus knew was that he was late. He was angry, and he had decided that this guard was going to move out of his way whether he liked it or not. He raised his hand and prepared to do something incredibly stupid, something that would soon involve the police and change his life forever. Marcus reached out and pushed Sergeant Mitchell's shoulder, trying to move him aside. The moment his hand made contact with the guard's uniform, everything changed. The crowd behind him gasped audibly, and several people immediately started recording with their phones. What had been a peaceful tourist gathering suddenly became the scene of a serious incident. Sergeant Mitchell didn't move from his position, but his training kicked in immediately. His eyes remained forward, but every muscle in his body tensed. He had been trained to deal with exactly this type of situation, and he knew that touching a royal guard while they were on duty was not just disrespectful, it was illegal. Marcus, however, was too angry to think clearly. When the guard didn't move after being pushed, Marcus became even more frustrated. He pushed again, this time harder, and shouted at the soldier to get out of his way. The crowd of tourists began to back away, sensing that something serious was happening. Children who had been laughing and pointing moments before now hid behind their parents. Adults who had been taking cheerful vacation photos suddenly looked worried and confused. Some people in the crowd began to leave, not wanting to be involved in whatever was about to happen next. But several tourists continued filming, realizing they might be witnessing something that would end up on the evening news. Their phones captured every moment as Marcus continued his confrontation with the immovable guard. What Marcus didn't see was the subtle hand signal that Sergeant Mitchell gave to his colleague stationed nearby. It was a small gesture barely noticeable to the untrained eye, but it communicated everything that needed to be said. Within seconds, other guards in the area had been alerted that there was a situation developing. Marcus pushed the guard a third time, and this time he also began yelling about how these soldiers were useless and just standing around for show. His voice carried across the area, drawing even more attention to the scene. People walking by stopped to see what was happening, and the crowd began to grow again. Sergeant Mitchell continued to stare straight ahead, but those who knew him well would have recognized the slight tightening around his eyes. He was a professional soldier who had faced real danger in combat zones, and he wasn't going to be intimidated by an angry businessman in an expensive suit. Meanwhile, the plainclothes police officers who were always stationed around the palace area had been alerted to the situation. Detective Inspector Sarah Collins was grabbing coffee from a nearby vendor when she heard the commotion. She immediately abandoned her coffee and began moving toward the crowd, speaking into her radio as she walked. Other officers throughout the area received her message and began converging on the scene. They were trained to respond quickly to any situation involving the royal guards, knowing that such incidents could escalate rapidly and potentially pose a security threat. Marcus was completely unaware that he was now the focus of a coordinated police response. He was too busy berating the guard and demanding that he move out of the way. His face was red with anger, and his expensive suit was now rumpled from his aggressive gesturing. The tourists with phones were getting excellent footage of Marcus making a fool of himself. Some of them were already uploading videos to social media, where they would soon go viral and be seen by millions of people around the world. One particularly clear video showed Marcus pushing the guard while screaming about being late for a meeting. The contrast between the calm professional soldier and the angry out-of-control businessman was stark. Comments on the video would later describe Marcus as entitled and disrespectful, while praising the guard for his restraint and professionalism. As Marcus continued his one-sided confrontation, Sergeant Mitchell made another subtle signal. This time it was directed at the approaching police officers. The message was clear. The situation was under control for now, but backup was needed. Detective Inspector Collins was now close enough to hear what Marcus was saying. She listened as he threatened to file complaints and demanded to know why the guard wouldn't move. She watched as he pushed the soldier again, and she knew that Marcus had just committed several serious offenses. The crowd around them had grown to nearly 50 people, all watching the drama unfold. Some were still taking pictures and videos, while others were shaking their heads in disapproval at Marcus's behavior. A few people tried to tell Marcus to stop, but he ignored them completely. Marcus had now been harassing the guard for nearly 5 minutes, and his anger showed no signs of cooling down. If anything, the guard's complete lack of response was making him even more frustrated. He couldn't understand why this man wouldn't acknowledge him or move out of his way. What Marcus still didn't realize was that he had already crossed several legal lines. Pushing the guard constituted assault. Interfering with a soldier on duty was a separate offense. Creating a public disturbance was another charge that could be filed. And threatening a member of the Royal Guard was taken very seriously by British law enforcement. As Detective Inspector Collins got into position, she prepared to end Marcus's tantrum once and for all. She had dealt with similar situations before, but something about this man's arrogance and complete lack of awareness told her that this arrest was going to be more complicated than usual. Detective Inspector Collins stepped forward and placed her hand firmly on Marcus's arm. Her voice was calm but authoritative as she identified herself as a police officer and told Marcus to step away from the guard immediately. The sudden appearance of law enforcement caught Marcus completely off guard. For the first time since the confrontation began, Marcus looked around and seemed to notice the crowd that had gathered. He saw dozens of people watching him, many with phones pointed in his direction. He saw the concerned faces of tourists who had come to London for a pleasant vacation and instead witnessed his public meltdown. But instead of backing down, Marcus made his situation much worse. He turned to Detective Inspector Collins and began arguing with her as well. He demanded to know why she was interfering with his business and insisted that he had every right to ask the guard to move. His voice grew louder as he explained that he was a taxpayer, and these guards worked for the public. Detective Inspector Collins remained patient but firm. She explained that the royal guards were on duty, and that interfering with them was a criminal offense. She told Marcus that he needed to calm down and come with her to discuss the situation away from the crowd. Her tone made it clear that this wasn't a request. Marcus looked at the detective inspector with disbelief. He couldn't understand how asking someone to move could possibly be a crime. In his mind, he was the victim of an unreasonable system that valued ceremony over common sense. He argued that he was just trying to get to work and that the guard should have common courtesy. The crowd watched in fascination as Marcus continued to dig himself deeper into trouble. Several people in the audience could be heard commenting that he should just apologize and leave. Others shook their heads in amazement at his stubborn refusal to accept that he had done anything wrong. Sergeant Mitchell continued to stand at attention, but those familiar with military bearing could see the slight signs of his growing concern. He had been trained to deal with many types of threats, but dealing with someone this determined to create problems required a different kind of patience. Detective Inspector Collins tried once more to resolve the situation peacefully. She explained to Marcus that if he would simply apologize to the guard and leave the area, she might be able to handle this with just a warning. She pointed out that he was clearly stressed about being late for work, and that everyone makes mistakes when they're under pressure. This offer of mercy should have been Marcus's salvation. Any reasonable person would have jumped at the chance to escape serious legal consequences with just an apology. But Marcus had never been particularly reasonable, and the stress of the morning had pushed him beyond rational thinking. Instead of accepting the detective inspector's generous offer, Marcus became even more indignant. He declared that he would absolutely not apologize for asking someone to do their job properly. He insisted that the guard should apologize to him for being unreasonable and blocking his path to an important meeting. The crowd's reaction to this statement was immediate and overwhelmingly negative. People began calling out that Marcus was being ridiculous and that he should take the officer's advice. Someone shouted that the guard was a hero who deserved respect, not harassment from entitled businessmen. Detective Inspector Collins realized that peaceful resolution was no longer possible. Marcus had made his choice, and now he would have to face the consequences. She reached for her handcuffs and began reciting the formal words that would change Marcus's day, from bad to catastrophic. As the detective inspector began the arrest process, other plainclothes officers who had been positioned around the area moved closer to provide backup. They surrounded Marcus in a way that looked casual to observers but was actually a carefully coordinated tactical formation. Marcus finally began to understand that this situation was spiraling far beyond what he had intended. He could see the handcuffs in the detective inspector's hands, and for the first time, he started to look genuinely worried rather than just angry. The tourists with cameras were having a field day. They had come to London expecting to see the changing of the guard and maybe take some nice photos with the famous soldiers. Instead, they were witnessing a real-life drama that would give them stories to tell for years to come. Children in the crowd were asking their parents what was happening to the angry man. Parents were using the situation as a teaching moment, explaining that this is what happens when people don't show respect for others and don't follow rules. Sergeant Mitchell maintained his professional composure throughout the entire incident, but later interviews would reveal that he had been impressed by how Detective Inspector Collins handled the situation. Her patience and professionalism in the face of Marcus's unreasonable behavior demonstrated the high standards of the Metropolitan Police. As the handcuffs clicked into place around Marcus's wrists, the full weight of his poor decisions finally began to sink in. His important client meeting was now impossible to attend. His expensive suit was wrinkled and disheveled. Dozens of strangers had recorded his public humiliation, and those videos were probably already spreading across the internet. But Marcus's troubles were just beginning. Being arrested was only the first step in a legal process that would soon involve lawyers, court appearances, and consequences he never could have imagined when he decided to push that royal guard. The police station was nothing like Marcus had expected. As Detective Inspector Collins led him through the booking process, the reality of his situation began to sink in. The handcuffs were removed, but he was fingerprinted, photographed, and asked to empty his pockets. His expensive watch, wallet, and phone were placed in a sealed bag and stored away. Marcus kept insisting that there had been a terrible mistake. He explained to everyone who would listen that he was a successful businessman with an important job and that he couldn't possibly be treated like a common criminal. The desk sergeant listened politely but continued processing the paperwork with professional efficiency. The charges against Marcus were more serious than he had realized. Detective Inspector Collins explained that he was being charged with assault on a police officer, since royal guards have police powers while on duty. He was also charged with causing a public disturbance and interfering with a soldier in the execution of his duties. Each charge carried potential fines and even jail time. When Marcus was finally allowed to make his phone call, he faced a difficult choice. He could call his boss to explain why he had missed the crucial client meeting, or he could call a lawyer to help him deal with his legal troubles. Either way, he was going to have to admit that his arrogant behavior had landed him in serious trouble. He decided to call his boss first, thinking he could explain the situation as a misunderstanding that would be cleared up quickly. But his boss, Jennifer Patterson, was not sympathetic. She had been fielding angry calls from the client all morning. And when Marcus explained that he was calling from a police station, she was furious. Jennifer told Marcus that the client had already decided to take their business elsewhere. The account that Marcus had been working on for months was lost, and the company's reputation had been damaged. She informed him that he should consider himself suspended pending a full investigation into his conduct. Marcus hung up the phone feeling shocked and defeated. In the span of a few hours, he had gone from being a successful marketing executive to an unemployed criminal defendant. His attempt to save a few minutes by confronting the royal guard had cost him his career and his freedom. While Marcus sat in his holding cell, the videos of his confrontation were spreading rapidly across social media. The footage showed him pushing Sergeant Mitchell and yelling at the stoic guard, creating a stark contrast between his aggressive behavior and the soldier's professional composure. The videos quickly went viral, with millions of views and thousands of comments from people around the world. Most of the comments were highly critical of Marcus, with people calling him entitled, disrespectful, and embarrassing. Many commenters praised the royal guard for his restraint and professionalism in the face of such provocation. News outlets picked up the story, and by evening, Marcus's confrontation with the royal guard was being discussed on television programs and news websites. His face was now known to people across the globe, but not for any reason he would want to be remembered. Back at the police station, Marcus was finally granted bail after spending several hours in custody. His lawyer, whom he had hired with a frantic phone call, explained that he would need to appear in court within the next few weeks. The lawyer also warned him that the video evidence made his case very difficult to defend. As Marcus left the police station, he discovered that reporters had somehow learned about his arrest. Cameras flashed as he walked to his car, and journalists shouted questions about his behavior and his treatment of the royal guard. Marcus tried to cover his face and hurry away, but the damage to his reputation was already done. The next few days were a nightmare for Marcus. His phone rang constantly with calls from reporters wanting interviews. His neighbors avoided him after seeing his story on the news. Friends and family members called to express their disappointment and embarrassment at his behavior. His apartment building's management company received complaints from other residents who didn't want to live near someone who had been arrested for assaulting a royal guard. His gym membership was revoked after other members complained about his presence. Even his local coffee shop, where he had been a regular customer for years, asked him not to return. Marcus tried to explain his side of the story to anyone who would listen. He insisted that he had just been trying to get to work, and that the whole situation had been blown out of proportion. But the video evidence was clear, and most people felt that his behavior had been inexcusable regardless of his reasons. Meanwhile, Sergeant Mitchell returned to his duties with the same professionalism he had shown during the confrontation. His fellow guards and commanding officers praised his handling of the situation, and he received letters of support from people around the world who had seen the video. The contrast between how the two men were being treated by the public couldn't have been more stark. While Marcus was facing criticism and consequences for his poor choices, Sergeant Mitchell was being celebrated as an example of military discipline and professionalism. As his court date approached, Marcus finally began to understand the full extent of his mistake. What had started as a moment of frustration about being late for work had spiraled into a legal nightmare that would follow him for years to come. The courtroom was packed with journalists and curious members of the public when Marcus's case was finally called. His lawyer had advised him to plead guilty and express sincere remorse, hoping that the judge would be lenient given that this was his first criminal offense. But Marcus still struggled with the idea of admitting he had done anything seriously wrong. Judge Sarah Henderson had reviewed the case file and watched the video evidence multiple times before the hearing. She was known for being fair but firm, especially when it came to cases involving disrespect for public servants and military personnel. The fact that this incident had been recorded and shared worldwide made it even more serious in her view. When Marcus stood before the judge, he looked very different from the confident businessman who had pushed Sergeant Mitchell just weeks earlier. His expensive suit had been replaced with more modest clothing, and his face showed the stress and sleepless nights he had endured since his arrest. Judge Henderson began by reading the charges against Marcus and explaining the potential penalties he faced. The assault charge alone could result in up to 6 months in jail and a substantial fine. The additional charges for disturbing the peace and interfering with a soldier on duty could add even more time and money to his punishment. Marcus's lawyer presented a plea for leniency, explaining that his client had been under severe work stress and had acted out of character. He pointed out that Marcus had no prior criminal record and was normally a law-abiding citizen who contributed to his community through his work and taxes. But Judge Henderson was not impressed by these arguments. She had seen the video evidence and she had read the police reports describing Marcus's behavior, not just toward Sergeant Mitchell, but also toward Detective Inspector Collins and the other officers who had tried to resolve the situation peacefully. The judge addressed Marcus directly, asking him to explain his actions and to demonstrate that he understood the seriousness of what he had done. This was Marcus's opportunity to show genuine remorse and to convince the court that he had learned from his mistakes. Unfortunately, Marcus's response revealed that he still didn't fully grasp the gravity of his actions. He began by apologizing, which seemed promising, but then he started making excuses. He explained about his important client meeting and his work stress. He mentioned that he was a taxpayer who helped fund the Royal Guard's salaries. Judge Henderson interrupted Marcus's explanation with a stern look. She made it clear that his reasons for being frustrated did not excuse his criminal behavior. She pointed out that thousands of people walk past the Royal Guards every day without feeling the need to push them or interfere with their duties. The judge then delivered a lecture that would be quoted in newspapers for weeks afterward. She explained that the Royal Guards are not tourist attractions or decorations, but highly trained soldiers who serve their country with honor and distinction. She said that disrespecting these men and women was tantamount to disrespecting all of Britain's military personnel. Judge Henderson also addressed the broader implications of Marcus's behavior. She noted that the incident had been seen by millions of people around the world, many of whom were visitors to Britain. His actions had potentially damaged the country's reputation and made tourists feel uncomfortable and unwelcome. The sentence that Judge Henderson handed down was harsher than Marcus had expected. He was fined £5,000, ordered to complete 200 hours of community service, and required to attend anger management classes. He was also banned from the area around Buckingham Palace for 1 year, but the legal penalties were only part of Marcus's punishment. The real consequences were the damage to his reputation and his future prospects. No marketing firm in London wanted to hire someone who had become internationally famous for assaulting a royal guard on camera. Marcus's attempts to find new employment were consistently unsuccessful. Potential employers would recognize his name or his face from the viral video, and interviews would end abruptly. Even jobs that had nothing to do with his previous marketing career seemed to be off-limits to him. His financial situation deteriorated quickly. Without his substantial salary, Marcus struggled to pay his rent, his legal fees, and the fine imposed by the court. He was forced to move to a smaller, cheaper apartment in a less desirable part of the city. The community service requirement added insult to injury. Marcus was assigned to clean graffiti and pick up litter in public parks, work that was physically demanding and poorly suited to someone who had spent years behind a desk. His fellow community service workers treated him with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. During his anger management classes, Marcus was forced to confront the reality of his behavior and its consequences. The counselor helped him understand that his sense of entitlement and his inability to control his temper had destroyed his life in a matter of minutes. Slowly, very slowly, Marcus began to realize that everyone who had tried to help him that day at the palace had been right. Sergeant Mitchell had been doing his job professionally and didn't deserve to be harassed. Detective Inspector Collins had offered him a way out that he should have taken gratefully. The judge had been fair in her sentencing, even if it felt harsh at the time. As the months passed, Marcus started to understand that his biggest mistake hadn't been pushing the guard or arguing with the police. His biggest mistake had been his complete inability to recognize when he was wrong and to accept responsibility for his actions. That character flaw had turned a minor incident into a life-changing catastrophe. 6 months after his sentencing, Marcus was a very different person than he had been on that fateful October morning. The anger management classes had been more helpful than he had expected, teaching him techniques for controlling his temper and recognizing when his emotions were getting the better of his judgment. His community service work, while initially humiliating, had given him a new perspective on life. Working alongside people from different backgrounds and circumstances had shown him that many problems he had considered earth-shattering were actually quite manageable when kept in proper perspective. Marcus had also started volunteering at a local veterans support center during his free time. This wasn't required as part of his sentence, but he felt drawn to help military personnel after learning more about the challenges they faced. The work helped him understand and appreciate the sacrifices made by people like Sergeant Mitchell. Through his volunteer work, Marcus met several former soldiers who shared their experiences with him. They helped him understand that Royal Guards are elite military personnel who have often served in combat zones and faced real danger in defense of their country. Their ceremonial duties at the palace were just one small part of their military service. One evening, while Marcus was helping organize donated clothing at the Veterans Center, he struck up a conversation with a man named David Thompson. David mentioned that he had served as a Royal Guard for 3 years before retiring from the military to become a teacher. Marcus hesitated, then decided to tell David about his own encounter with a Royal Guard. He expected judgment or anger, but David listened thoughtfully and then asked Marcus what he had learned from the experience. This conversation became a turning point in Marcus's journey toward redemption. David explained that Royal Guards are trained to remain composed no matter what happens around them. They face harassment, inappropriate behavior, and even physical contact from tourists and others on a regular basis, but they must maintain their professionalism at all times. The discipline required for this job is extraordinary, and it deserves respect rather than ridicule. Marcus began to research Sergeant Mitchell's military record, not to cause him any trouble, but to better understand the man he had wronged. He discovered that the sergeant had served with distinction in Afghanistan and had been decorated for his bravery under fire. He had saved the lives of fellow soldiers and had demonstrated the kind of courage that most people could never imagine. This revelation filled Marcus with shame, but also with a determination to make amends in whatever way possible. He wrote a letter to Sergeant Mitchell, acknowledging his wrongful behavior and expressing sincere remorse for his actions. He didn't expect a response, but he felt it was important to take responsibility publicly. To Marcus's surprise, Sergeant Mitchell wrote back. The letter was brief but gracious, acknowledging Marcus's apology and expressing hope that he had learned from the experience. The sergeant mentioned that he had no hard feelings and wished Marcus well in his efforts to rebuild his life. This correspondence gave Marcus the courage to take an even bigger step. He reached out to several journalists who had covered his story. offering to give interviews about what he had learned from his mistakes. His goal was to use his notoriety for something positive, perhaps preventing others from making similar errors in judgment. The interviews were difficult for Marcus, requiring him to relive his humiliation and admit his faults publicly, but the response was surprisingly positive. Many people appreciated his willingness to take responsibility and his efforts to educate others about respecting military personnel. Marcus also decided to write a detailed account of his experience, from his initial confrontation with Sergeant Mitchell, through his legal proceedings and personal transformation. He submitted this article to several publications, hoping it might serve as a cautionary tale for others who might be tempted to act out in moments of frustration. One major newspaper agreed to publish Marcus's story, and the response was overwhelming. Readers appreciated his honesty and his willingness to admit his mistakes publicly. Many shared their own stories of times when anger or stress had led them to behave poorly, and several thanked Marcus for reminding them to treat others with respect. The positive response to his article led to speaking opportunities at schools and community organizations. Marcus found himself talking to young people about the importance of controlling their temper and treating all people, especially those in uniform, with respect and dignity. During one of these speaking engagements, a student asked Marcus if he regretted pushing the Royal Guard, given all the positive changes that had resulted from his experience. Marcus thought carefully before answering that while he was grateful for the lessons he had learned, he deeply regretted causing pain and embarrassment. To Sergeant Mitchell and others, he explained that there were many ways he could have learned these lessons without hurting other people and damaging his own life so severely. The student's question reminded him that personal growth should never come at the expense of others' dignity and well-being. As his community service neared completion, Marcus reflected on how much his life had changed. He was no longer the arrogant, entitled businessman who had thought rules didn't apply to him. He had learned humility, empathy, and the importance of treating everyone with respect, regardless of their role or position in society. 2 years after the incident that changed his life, Marcus Williams stood once again near Buckingham Palace. But this time he wasn't there as an angry businessman trying to get to a meeting. He was there as part of a charity event he had helped organize to support military veterans and their families. The event had grown out of his volunteer work at the Veterans Center and his speaking engagements about respecting military personnel. What had started as his personal attempt to make amends had evolved into a significant fundraising effort that would provide real help to people who had served their country. Marcus watched as families of veterans gathered for the ceremony, many of them sharing stories of their loved ones' service and sacrifice. He saw children who had grown up without fathers or mothers who were deployed overseas. He met spouses who had struggled to rebuild their lives after their partners returned home with physical or emotional wounds from combat. The keynote speaker for the event was a retired general who had commanded troops in several recent conflicts. In his speech, he emphasized the importance of civilian support for military personnel and thanked Marcus for his efforts to bridge the gap between the military and civilian communities. After the general's speech, Marcus was invited to say a few words about his journey from antagonist to advocate. He spoke honestly about his past mistakes and the lessons he had learned. He emphasized that everyone has the potential to change and grow, but that change requires genuine remorse and consistent effort. In the audience, Marcus noticed several royal guards who were attending the event during their off-duty time. Seeing their uniforms brought back memories of that October morning when his life had taken such a dramatic turn. But now, instead of anger or embarrassment, he felt respect and gratitude for their service. After the ceremony, Marcus was approached by one of the guards, who introduced himself as Corporal Williams. The young soldier thanked Marcus for his work supporting veterans and mentioned that his efforts had been noticed and appreciated throughout the military community. This conversation reminded Marcus of how far he had come, not just in terms of his attitude toward military personnel, but in his overall approach to life. He had learned to listen before speaking, to consider others before himself, and to treat every person with dignity regardless of their position or role. Marcus's professional life had also slowly begun to recover. While he couldn't return to his previous high-level marketing position, He had found work with a nonprofit organization that focused on veteran employment issues. The job paid much less than his previous salary, but it gave him a sense of purpose that his corporate career had never provided. His new colleagues appreciated his dedication and his unique perspective on the challenges facing veterans. As they transitioned back to civilian life, Marcus's own experience with dramatic life changes helped him understand and relate to the struggles of former military personnel, adjusting to new careers and circumstances. The viral video of his confrontation with Sergeant Mitchell occasionally resurfaced on social media, usually during discussions about entitled behavior or respect for military personnel. But now, when people shared the video, it was often accompanied by articles about Marcus's transformation and his work supporting veterans. Marcus had learned to accept that the video would probably follow him for the rest of his life. But instead of seeing it as a permanent source of shame, he now viewed it as a reminder of his capacity for growth and change. The person in that video was someone he no longer recognized or wanted to be. On quiet evenings, Marcus sometimes walked past the palace gates where his confrontation with Sergeant Mitchell had taken place. He would pause and remember that morning, not with regret for the consequences he had faced, but with gratitude for the wake-up call that had ultimately made him a better person. He often wondered what his life would have been like if he had simply walked around the crowd that morning instead of confronting the guard. He probably would have made it to his client meeting, kept his job, and continued living his self-centered existence without ever learning the important lessons that had transformed him. In many ways, Marcus realized losing everything had been the best thing that could have happened to him. The person he had been before the incident was successful on paper but empty inside. He had been focused solely on his own needs and desires, completely oblivious to the impact of his behavior on others. The legal consequences, public humiliation, and financial struggles that followed his arrest had been painful, but they had also been necessary. They had forced him to confront his character flaws and to make fundamental changes in how he approached life and relationships. Marcus had also reconnected with his family during his journey of redemption. His parents, who had been embarrassed and disappointed by his behavior, were proud of the man he had become. His sister, who had distanced herself from him after the incident, now called regularly to check on his volunteer work and his speaking engagements. The relationships in his life were deeper and more meaningful than they had ever been when he was focused solely on career advancement and material success. He had learned that true satisfaction comes from contributing to something larger than yourself and from treating others with kindness and respect. As Marcus reflected on his transformation, he received a message that would provide the perfect ending to his story. Sergeant Mitchell, who had been promoted to staff sergeant, was being honored at a military ceremony for his years of distinguished service. The sergeant's commanding officer had heard about Marcus's advocacy work and invited him to attend the ceremony. Marcus was deeply moved by this invitation and grateful for the opportunity to honor the man he had once wronged. At the ceremony, he watched as Staff Sergeant Mitchell received his commendation with the same dignity and professionalism he had displayed during their confrontation 2 years earlier. After the ceremony, Marcus had the opportunity to speak privately with Staff Sergeant Mitchell. The conversation was brief but meaningful, with both men acknowledging how much they had learned from their encounter. The sergeant expressed his respect for Marcus's efforts to turn a negative situation into something positive for the military community. As they shook hands, Marcus felt a sense of closure that he hadn't expected. The circle that had begun with his moment of poor judgment was now complete, ending not with lingering resentment or regret, but with mutual respect and understanding. Walking away from the ceremony, Marcus realized that his story had become something he never could have imagined. What started as a tale of entitled arrogance and its consequences had evolved into a story of redemption, personal growth, and the power of taking responsibility for one's actions. The angry businessman who had pushed a royal guard in a moment of frustration was gone forever, replaced by a man who understood the value of service, sacrifice, and treating every person with dignity. Marcus had learned that true strength comes not from demanding respect, but from earning it through consistent acts of kindness and humility. His journey from villain to advocate had taken 2 years, but Marcus knew that the lessons he had learned would guide him for the rest of his life. Every day he carried with him the memory of that October morning, and the reminder that a single moment of poor judgment can change everything. But that redemption is always possible for those willing to do the hard work of becoming better people.